You're listening to the Game of Inches podcast, powered by Mayflower Sports. Now, here are your hosts, Jacob Smith and Andrew McGinnis.
It is Friday, April 22nd. You are listening to the Game of Inches podcast, powered by Mayflower Sports. Happy to have Ben Steiner with us today. Ben, happy to have you here. First time really meeting and talking over the internet, of course, but we did kind of come in contact last week. I first heard your name through you being in Nova Scotia, in Wolfville with the U Cup, of course, and thought I'd reach out. I checked out your profile. I saw you do stuff with CBC Sports, U Sports as well, and so many different things. So I want to thank you for joining us and give you the chance to just tell folks at home a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, pleasure to join you guys. Thanks for having me on. And I'm Ben Steiner, raised on the West Coast in Vancouver, and then living in Toronto now. And I've been doing some work for CBC Sports, doing some work for the OUA, U Sports, Toronto Star, but really sort of have put myself into Canadian University sport. And if you have any followers who follow Atlantic University sport, it's a lot bigger than just the AUS and 56 schools. So it's quite a bit of time that it takes up.
Yeah, just quickly, I just want to ask you about the U Sports Cup since you were there. How was it? Because a lot of people get confused about the quality of play in the CIS in general. Just can you give us a little insight on how the play was during the U Sport Cup?
Oh, it was electric. I mean, all you have to do is really look at that final between Université Québec à Trois-Rivières and the Alberta Golden Bears. And Alberta looked as though they had it in the bag, and UQTR comes out and wins in double overtime. It doesn't get much more competitive and exceptional than that. And 66 saves for Alexis Gravel in the final. And just at the start of this 2021-2022 season, Alexis Gravel was with the Montreal Canadiens in their rookie camp and vying for an AHL contract. He played some games in the ECHL. So the pro level's there. Over 70 guys from the OUA, AUS, and Canada West left to go play in the professional game during the extended COVID stoppage that was sort of extended the Christmas break, I guess. And if 70 guys can make that step, then it's pretty indicative of sort of where the league's at. And when you're watching the top two teams in UQTR and Alberta in the last game of the season, any of those guys could step into a professional game and not look out of place. And one of those guys, Noah Philp, he stepped into an NHL contract just 5 days later with the Edmonton Oilers. So you don't see that too often. So the level of play, especially in the AUS, but as we've seen this year, no AUS team in the final, really across the country, the level of play exceptional in U Sports hockey.
Absolutely. I mean, people's career, they're not over after the CHL is done. If you go undrafted, there's lots of time, lots of space. Of course, Gravel, former Halifax Moosehead, and an unbelievable run for him in Wolfville. Ben, I remember how disappointed I was being in Halifax. Of course, it was the start of COVID, pretty much the pandemic, when everything got shut down the first time around. And of course, St. Mary's was doing very well. A lot of the local teams were playing very well. And of course, obviously there was commitments going on in Halifax. So the event gets turned to Wolfville. I just wanted to ask your experience. Have you been to Wolfville before? Was that your first time? What were your thoughts on kind of the event, how it wasn't really in Halifax this time at the big Scotiabank Center? It was now in Wolfville.
Well, I mean, the puck did say Halifax on it. So it sort of was in Halifax, at least according to the puck. But yes, it was at Wolfville at Acadia University. And it was a special atmosphere. Usually they put them at the junior arenas in sort of more central area. And that means that you're not necessarily getting a crowded atmosphere. But the atmosphere at the final was okay. People were there, but it was very sort of subdued because there weren't necessarily fans for UQTR or Alberta. But the quarterfinal between Alberta and Acadia was just amazing in terms of atmosphere. They packed that arena. Wolfville and Acadia University really got behind the hosting and the tournament as a whole. Really every game had a bit of atmosphere, and that's definitely not the case at a lot of U Cups when you're playing, say, a Acadia versus Alberta game in, I don't know, Lethbridge. There's not necessarily that interest, but there was interest in basically every game. The crowd in a double overtime game between UBC and UQTR in the quarterfinal was exceptional as well. But personally, I loved Wolfville. I loved the small town vibe that it had. Of course, it is a small town. I hadn't been there before. I have a couple of friends who do go to Acadia, so I'd heard a bit about it. And some people said it was too small to have fun, but I had plenty of fun. But then again, I was spending most of my time in the rink, so I don't have a great idea of Wolfville. I did take a walk up to get a coffee, but not a great idea of really what Wolfville is, because I mean, there were long days in the rink.
It's a great spot. I've spent a lot of time up in Acadia. A lot of my friends went there too for university, so I had my fair share of fun times up there. But just to dive back into the U Sports there, was there any players that, maybe didn't get the national recognition that maybe used this tournament as to highlight? I know you mentioned the guy that signed with the Edmonton Oilers there, but is there anybody else that you really kind of like want to put a spotlight on that maybe necessarily didn't get that spotlight throughout the U Sports Cup?
I think the Ryerson Rams team as a whole, and just their ability to take down a very strong UNB team in the quarterfinal, and going into that game, nobody expected Ryerson to put up any sort of a challenge to UNB. This was Ryerson's first time competing at the University Cup, first time in 60 years they made it past the second round of the OUA playoffs, which is a little crazy to think. And they put together an exceptional performance against UNB, and really any of those players looked like they really fit with UNB, who's consistently one of the top 2 teams in the country. This year, I think they probably were the second best team in the country. I don't think UQTR, who ended up winning, was even in the conversation until the end. But it was Alberta and UNB throughout the entire season, and I think UNB was well in second. I know that some people would want to push back against that, but I do think Alberta was quite strong. And I was shocked to see Ryerson sort of pull it out of the bag. And so in terms of players who sort of flew under the radar, that entire Ryerson team, man, they were guns a-blazing that whole tournament, especially against UNB.
We already touched on kind of how, players can turn pro, whether it's the Coast League, AHL, or even NHL. And we've talked to several players that have gone over to Europe from Nova Scotia or just somewhere in the AUS conference there. And obviously there was that pause during this season, and a lot of players, they were anxious to get back on the ice. They didn't want to have that long several weeks where they weren't playing hockey, weren't practicing with their team. And so Jake and I, before the Christmas break, we went to film, obviously, a heated rivalry in the Maritimes with St. Mary's versus Dalhousie. Ended up being a comeback victory for Dalhousie, shootout victory. And we find out just 3 or 4 weeks after that several of the key players for both those teams in the second half will no longer be on those rosters because they wanted to play hockey. They went elsewhere. They went to the coast or they went to Europe. What's your take on that? I mean, players having to leave mid-season, wanting to go, or just kind of the journeys that you've heard from players going from U Sports to the pros?
Yeah, I mean, at SMU, they were really rolling, and then they lose a guy like Mitch Balmas, and you can't really save a season when you lose that type of quality on your top line. And they could have very well made the U Cup like they did 2 years ago when it was in Halifax. But for a lot of these players, you're right. They just wanted to play. And 40 of them signed in the Coast or higher. So if you're signing in the Coast or higher, I can sort of wrap my head around it. A couple guys signed in the Southern Professional Hockey League or the Federal League in the States, and those are quite low. You're not necessarily making a ton of money. That's really just you want to play and you want to hit the ice. So those guys, I don't totally understand of why you would go down that route unless you're ensuring that you also get your degree, or you're just finishing off your 5th year, or you've spent 6 years in school, something like that. And I know a couple of guys who are in that situation. Kyle Clark of the U of T Varsity Blues comes to mind. He's playing with the Huntsville Havoc in the SPHL. But if you're playing in the Coast or higher, there's a legitimate shot that you have, if you impress, to climb the ranks in North American pro hockey. So whether you're signing an AHL deal or an ECHL deal, there's a decent chance that you've got of sort of making a career in pro hockey, even if it is at the minor pro level. So I don't necessarily blame a lot of these guys for taking that chance. The worry, though, is so many organizations were bringing in players because of COVID, and they were missing players at every level that they had to keep shuffling guys around. So there's just a question of how many of the guys who left to go to the Coast necessarily have that spot next year.
Right.
Do you think
is it worth it?
Yeah, I was going to say, that's exactly what I was going to ask. Do you think it's worth it? And do you think a lot of the guys that seeing other players make that jump are going to try and follow suit? Do you think more so now that U Sports has an actual avenue to kind of propel some of these kids through and actually give them a shot at pro careers?
I mean, we've seen it before. Like a guy like Derek Ryan on the Edmonton Oilers, he came through the University of Alberta. We've seen it with UNB as well. There's a ton of guys in the ECHL who've carved out careers, a ton of guys in the AHL over in Europe as well. So the pathway is there to get a confident pro career right out of U Sports. And as Andrew said, it's not necessarily an end of the road when you leave the CHL and go to university hockey. It can very well just be another step in development. A lot of guys need just a few more years to get up to the speed of the pro game, and be able to sort of mature both physically and mentally. So I think that pathway has really already been established in terms of establishing a pro career right out of U Sports. But will this change things? Probably not, because these guys left with the main push factor being they just wanted to play hockey. And if everything goes to plan, we're not going to have another one of those stoppages.
Ben, I used to do some announcing and play-by-play stuff with volleyball and basketball with the Dow Tigers, and they've had an impressive basketball program over the last several years. Ever since Rick Plato took over as the head coach, they've been super dominant. I just want to get your take on the CEBL and some of those leagues that, they're kind of trying to build, Canadian sports and Canadian university. Of course, the CPL, the soccer league, they have the U Sports draft now. Just putting a lot of emphasis, I guess, on kind of growing the game in Canada and not having these players move to the States or elsewhere to have to build their game. What can you say about these leagues that are being created? Because I love to see it. And, a good friend of ours plays in the CPL for the Halifax team, and it's just been great to see the city rally around it.
Yeah, having these leagues is integral to having sort of importance on U Sports careers, because it doesn't look like the end of the road as it did in a lot of sports other than hockey for a while. And so now guys can impress in U Sports and get drafted into the CEBL. And one of those guys, Kevin Vino from the Dalhousie Tigers, he got drafted to Hamilton last year, impressed, and he's back with Hamilton this year. Adam Page from University of Alberta signed a full pro contract this year now that he's graduated. So there's definitely a good pathway there that's being established, and same thing in the Canadian Premier League as well. And the team that you've got there in Halifax with Stephen Hart, they rely heavily on U Sports players as well. Of course, they're missing Joao Morelli, so it might be a bit of a rough season going ahead for the Wanderers, but it establishes an integral pathway for these players coming up through university sport in Canada. The thing is, it's only on the men's side. We need the women's leagues. We need the CWEBL. We need not necessarily having the W, but just an option for women not to hit that ceiling, because there's just as many women who are ending their university careers unable to play anywhere. And we're seeing maybe a bit of a shift in that in soccer with League One BC coming in and League One Ontario, and the PLSQ in Quebec is giving a bit of an option for these women to play coming out of university. But there's really not a professional option in Canada. And unless you're in the national team picture by 21, you're basically hearing that your career is over, which is heartbreaking, because every national team in the top 10 has a domestic league except Canada.
Yeah, you mentioned the CPL there and kind of soccer. I'm a huge soccer guy, so I just wanted to ask you, basically, like, it's not a theory, but it's proven, like you said, like you need these domestic leagues, and you kind of need the funding into those leagues to help propel us to the next kind of like stepping stone, whether that be women's soccer, men's soccer, Canadian basketball leagues or whatever. Do you think that it's feasible for Canada to keep sort of putting this funding into leagues like this and to continue to grow and grab the attention of the country, basically? Because I feel like for a long time it's been a really hockey dominated country, and it's really nice to see that, like, the CPL came around, now Canada's qualified for the World Cup, and that there's actually other pathways in sports to be professionals in Canada besides just playing hockey.
Yeah, I think it's incredibly important to the Canadian sporting landscape to continue building these leagues. But again, we don't necessarily need more men's leagues. We don't need the men's professional volleyball league. Well, that'd be great. The focus should be on getting a women's league in basketball and soccer, the two sports where Canada is exploding on the world stage. And in terms of women's soccer, falling behind without a league against the rest of the world. And on the men's side, even though the CPL hasn't necessarily influenced the 2022 qualification, you can bet that there's going to be players on the 2026 team that's automatically qualified, likely, that have come through the CPL, whether that's Max Ferrari, Diadine Abzi, Joel Waterman, who had a cup of coffee with Cavalry. So these leagues are integral to the Canadian sporting landscape, and there's lots of space for them to grow as well. There's lots of communities they're not in yet, and they don't have to be in the major metropolises where the NHL is necessarily.
And just diving into the World Cup, obviously, Jake and I have discussed it a lot on our podcast. We're super excited. Jake's a bigger soccer fan than me, but I've certainly gotten into it. I've rallying around the country. I've gotten into soccer as well, just watching the CPL. They've sold me on it, and of course, having a friend on the team helps as well. But I want to ask before we jump into the World Cup and the Canada men's national team and the women's team as well. Can you tell us about some of the work you've done? I know you're a writer and you do a lot of work there. I see you on social media. Lots of tweets there about the soccer. What's some of the work that you do with soccer?
Yeah, lots of tweets. But yeah, I write for a couple websites in terms of Canadian soccer. I've done some stuff for the CBC where I am part-time, and then I've also done for Between the Sticks a lot, which is a website based out west, and a couple folks from there now writing for the Canadian Premier League and One Soccer. And well, I sort of just go around the sort of blogosphere in terms of Canadian soccer, but also pitching some more in-depth stories to bigger outlets. But I've been around the Canadian soccer scene for a while. I started covering my first national team game that I covered was 2018, Canada versus French Guiana in Vancouver. And I think that was in front of 10,000 people. So definitely before the big rush of Canada, Jamaica in front of 35,000 or so at BMO Field. So I've seen the growth for a while. I remember Olivier Okian and Tosin Ricketts banging in the goals for Canada. Well, not so much. They're trying to bang in the goals for Canada. And it's certainly a bit of a different picture now with Canada heading to the World Cup.
Yeah, just before we dive into the World Cup, I just want to ask about the CPL again. Who are some of the players that you like in the CPL? Because there's actually, like you already said, El Habzi, like there's some really good players that play in the CPL. Joao Morelli is another one, top goal scorer the last 2 years. Obviously, he's a little bit older and he's an import, but just some of the players that you really like in the league, or you think that maybe can use the CPL as not a stepping stone, but help further their development to maybe push on to that next level?
Yeah, there's different ways you can necessarily look at it, because what is that next level? Is that next level playing for the Canadian national team? Well, that level's gotten so high that you're not going to be called up regularly to the Canadian national team when you're playing for Pacific or Halifax. You've got to be likely with an MLS side if you're going to be in North America to get called up to the Canadian national team at this point. But to just advance your career, all my thoughts go to Marco Bustos at Pacific. He's been exceptional. He had a hat trick of assists against Valor last week, and he's easily the best player in the CPL, at least with a Canadian passport. Joao Morelli might have something to say about that if he had a Canadian passport. But Bustos is absolutely exceptional. He could step into, I think, the MLS, and once you're at the MLS level, you can start talking about Canadian national team call-ups. He didn't really settle when he came out of the Whitecaps Academy with the Whitecaps first team. Sort of danced around the Canadian soccer scene for a while, but he's really established himself at Pacific. So I think if there's one player that can step up to another level, it would be Marco Bustos.
And of course, we talk about Canada finally, back in the World Cup, back in the big stage. And it's something that we've been waiting for a long time. And the buildup was huge. Talk about the fans, waiting outside to, cheer them on as they even just march into the arena, or excuse me, to the, the center in the field house before they even get there, arriving in the cars, and all the noise they're making, the excitement in the air. Really, just like, I think it's in Canada in general to get behind anything. I mean, I think if we had a national curling team in a gold medal game, the entire country would be around them. It's just how we are as Canadians. But it's been so great to see the support this team has gotten. Every single person tuning in and watching, and of course, as you saw, whether it's out west or here in the east, the support has been unbelievable from this team. Of course, they're proving it on the field as well. I mean, they're putting up the results, and they've earned every bit of their position now in the World Cup. What can you tell us about this team, and what's impressed you the most?
Well, I mean, with curling, Canada does get behind the national curling teams quite a lot, whether that's Brad Gushu or Kevin Cooey, whoever's skipping that men's team, or Rachel Homan, Jennifer Jones, where we won't get into curling too much. I was watching curling last week here. But this Canadian team, just absolutely exceptional, right? You have a guy like Alistair Johnston burst onto the scene, came through the MLS Super Draft. Kyle Laren came through the MLS Super Draft after playing in the NCAA. So if you want to talk about the importance of college and university drafts, that's what this Canadian national team is for some of the important players. But just an absolutely exceptional story, because the plan for Herdman, it wasn't necessarily 2022. Yeah, he said it the whole time, but even he knew that might be a stretch. But this team has exploded. It's not every day that you get handed a Jonathan David or an Alphonso Davies, two world-class players, best in the world at their positions. So yeah, it's just an exceptional team, and the support has really gotten behind it, which is nice to see. It's not something that we've necessarily seen in Canada at the national team level before. We saw it a bit when the World Cup went across Canada in 2015 on the women's side, but even they lost to the English team in the quarterfinals, I believe it was. Quarterfinals. And so we haven't necessarily seen the support for the men's side in a long time, and if ever, because yes, they did make it in '86, but it wasn't an exciting group. It wasn't a group that you were talking about, oh, maybe they can make it out of their group. Could they even make the quarterfinals, pull off an upset against a Spain or a Germany? So, but those conversations are happening with this Canadian team. So it doesn't seem like there's really a roof for this Canadian team. And the excitement is palpable coast to coast.
Yeah, you mentioned obviously the luxury of having a Jonathan David and an Alphonso Davies, but I really like the core of the group, and it's really interesting to me as a soccer fan that we're much more on the global stage. Like there's a lot of players like Atakubi's playing in Turkey. We got Tejan Buchanan in Belgium. We got Steven Eustáquio in Portugal. Like, what do you make of us really trying to put our mark in the European soccer scene? Because obviously that's where most of the best players, I won't say all of them, because you never know, there might be somebody coming up through anywhere in the world that just hasn't quite made it there yet. But what do you make of us making our imprint in Europe and some of the top leagues in the world?
I don't think it's necessarily important to be in Europe, but I think it's important to be playing in the best leagues in the world. And those happen to be in Europe. So that's where these Canadian players need to be to excel and continue to grow this team in this program. Is they have to be able to push that world ranking high enough to get easy work permits at every European league, especially in England, where they haven't necessarily settled in yet. Maybe Jonathan David does after the World Cup, but it's important to play against the best players and push yourself to get better, not just when you're playing with the national team, but every week when you're training against the best players and playing against the best players.
Of course, I have to make sure I correct myself, and I am talking about the men's team back there for the first time in 36 years. The women's team in Canada has done very well, and have to give them credit as well. I see a lot of people, talking about Canada is back in the World Cup, of course. So the Canada men's team back in the World Cup, and want to give the women's team lots of credit for what they've done as well. But 36 years, they're back. The qualifiers are over, Ben. Here they are. The groups are established here. What are your thoughts on what we saw from those groups, and what Canada drew here?
Well, Canada's group is certainly interesting. They've got a lot of quality opponents, but what were you going to expect when you get to the World Cup? It's the top 32 teams in the world at this point, or top 31 teams. Italy's a top 32 team and not there. But top 32 to come through qualifying, and Canada's got a difficult task ahead of them. Can they beat Croatia? Maybe. Can they beat Morocco? Maybe a bit easier than Croatia. Same with Belgium. Like, maybe they can beat Belgium. Belgium's on the bit of an older side now. So is Croatia. Morocco, I could actually see making a bit of a dark horse run just because they're young and skilled. So yeah, it'll be an interesting group. I don't think it's necessarily an easy group, but no group at the World Cup was going to be an easy group for Canada. And at this point, Canada's playing with house money, right? They weren't expected to make the World Cup during this cycle. They weren't expected to make the World Cup in the top 32, and they were going to have to wait till it was expanded. So Canada's in it. They're at the party. That's all you can ask for at this point, and they've got the quality to turn some heads. It's just a question of what they can do on the day. At the end of the day, it's 3 90-minute games, and all you need is a win and probably a draw.
Yeah, I definitely think that I think we could beat Morocco. I watched a lot of the African Cup of Nations. Obviously, that's a little bit of a different type of tournament. It's a lot more physical. I think Morocco really underperformed. I know Hakeem Ziyech and the coach really haven't seen eye to eye. So like he's not with the national team right now. I don't know if he's going to be back for the World Cup, but I really think that we do have a chance. I think the game for us is Croatia. I think if we can somehow get a draw against Croatia, I think it's a big task to ask us to nick a point off of Belgium with the quality that they have. But I really think that there's a chance for us to go through. Basically, my question is what do you think Canada really needs to do to kind of help propel themselves more so as on-field play instead of just like hypotheticals, because we've had the luxury of being able to be on the front foot in the CONCACAF. There's not too many games where we had to sit back and soak up pressure. Obviously, there was a couple, but the way this Canada team was really flying, we were able to kind of put our mark on the CONCACAF qualifying. What do you think they need to do to kind of more so give themselves a shot to get through?
I don't think they necessarily have to change a thing. I think the way they Canada's been playing and the quality that they've shown, especially when they're playing in a 3-5-2, whether that's Laren and David up top, or some other sort of mixture in their strikers. If you initiate the wingbacks and you have whether that's Atakubi coming up or Davies playing as a wingback, they've got the systems there, and Herdman has shown that he can adapt to different playing styles. So I don't think Canada necessarily has to change anything drastic to find success against the best teams in the world. I think they can go up against an Argentina or a Belgium, the best teams in the world, and like potentially win the game. It just depends on how the systems work that day, how the players go, and of course it's sports. It comes down to a couple lucky bounces as well.
Some people would argue that, playing Belgium on match day 1 could be an advantage, getting that toughest team out of the way. Obviously, you get better as you progress. Of course, you kind of would work towards that, but also maybe get that match out of the way. It's, fresh and you can kind of move on. What are your thoughts on kind of the schedule that's been released as well, not just the grouping?
It's an interesting take because you're playing Morocco last, and on paper, that's the game that you should have your best chance at winning. So what you wouldn't want is to get 2 losses against Belgium and Croatia and then go play Morocco and have that game mean nothing because the other 2 already have 4 points. So it's a little bit of a like 2 birds in the hand, 1 in the bush sort of thing, where you would want to get that game done, but you also want that Morocco game early just to get potentially those 3 points. But then again, Canada could beat Belgium very well. So why not just go beat Belgium? Go 9 points. What's wrong with that?
Let's do it.
I love it. I love it. Just to obviously we'll continue to talk about Canada, but I just want to ask, who are some of the teams that you really like outside of Canada for the World Cup? Obviously, there's a couple sleeper nations that I have. Like I really like the Senegalese side. I think that they could really do damage. I'm a huge fan of the South Korean team. They have a pretty favorable draw. Who do you like more so as some dark horses? Because obviously there's Argentina, there's Brazil, there's Germany, there's France. There's so many really top nations. But is there any kind of dark horse sides that you really like that think that can cause some damage in this tournament?
Does Croatia still count because they made the final in 2018? I would still count Croatia within that sort of realm because you don't really see them as a team that's sort of in that realm of the Brazils, Argentinas, and France's. But like Morocco as well, they could very well be a dark horse. I think one of Canada or Morocco gets out of the group, and I think that team probably loses to Spain or Germany in the next round, but it could potentially beat a Spain or a Germany and make their way to the quarterfinal. So I think the 2 teams that sort of have the most potential to be a dark horse are Canada and Morocco, and they're both in the same group.
Yeah, anybody with Luka Modric on their team has a pretty good chance of going through.
Yeah, I would say that as well. But you would say the same thing about Eden Hazard and Alphonso Davies and the Moroccan team as a whole and their cohesiveness. So like it's a really open group that might not seem open on paper.
And for people listening through podcast form or watching on YouTube or Twitter, what can they expect from you during this event, and can find some information and articles through you?
Well, we'll see if I'm there. I might be. Well, it's yet to be decided whether I'm there.
That's great.
But yeah, there'll definitely be something. I don't have my plans for Qatar 2022 ironed out yet, but there'll definitely be something.
I've been begging one of the boys to come with me. Just any one of you. I don't even care who it is at this point. Just one of you come over and make the trip with me, because obviously it'd be awesome to see a game, but just to experience the environment of like a global event, I think would be so awesome. But I think if you have the chance to get over there, I think you should definitely take it because it's once in a lifetime experience. Obviously the World Cup's going to be here. Well, we're co-hosting, but it's going to be here in 2026. I think it would just be so cool to be able to go see Canada in another part of the world and experience their culture and get to experience everybody else's culture. But I just want to ask you a quick question about Ritchie Larea. I think Ritchie Larea might be one of the most underrated players that Canada has. Obviously, with Davies going down, he's had to take on a much bigger role. What do you make of Ritchie Larea? And what type of player he is for the national team.
He's a very important player for the national team on both sides of the ball. Of course, when he was drafted out of, again, the NCAA, he showed that he was a bit more defensive minded, but then he really developed as a more attacking player, especially playing sort of that wing back role with Toronto FC. The problem is he's not playing at Nottingham Forest. He got his first appearance just a couple of days ago, 20 minutes or so. He got a nice run around. He got to say hi to the fans, but that's not what he needs. He needs to be sharp and getting regular minutes. So he's an important player, but playing at Nottingham Forest doesn't look like it was the right move.
I wanted to ask you about John Herdman. Obviously, lots of success in his past, a bright future here with this team. Have you ever gotten the chance to speak with him? And what are your thoughts really on what he's been able to do to Canada soccer?
I have had a chance to speak with John Herdman throughout the years, back when he was with the women's national team, and now that he's with the men as well. And just an exceptional guy to really bring these athletes and push them to their limits, because there's a real pride in wearing that Canadian shirt. And it was felt with the women's national team, and now it's felt with the men's national team as well. There's like, these guys are proud to represent Canada. They're proud to be a part of this. And that wasn't necessarily something that you had throughout the last little while with especially the Canadian men. It was, oh, I've got to go represent Canada. Okay, then I guess I'll do it, or I'll go represent England. Cough, cough, Owen Hargreaves. There wasn't that pride in wearing the Canadian shirt, and I really think that it's just the amped upness and the pride that I say it too much, but that's really what John Herdman is able to bring to the Canadian group.
Yeah, I think Herdman gives me, like, I'm a Liverpool fan, so I've been a Liverpool fan for a long time. He really gives me that like Jurgen Klopp effect, where like you're willing to like run through a brick wall for this guy. Like,
For sure.
he puts so much trust in his players. He has so much jubilation on the sideline or on the touch line. He really makes you want to play for the badge and him. What did you make of the signing at the time? Because I have a lot of friends that are really deep into soccer. Like, they know everything about everything. I know a lot, but definitely not as much as them. They weren't too particularly thrilled with the appointing at the time. They thought that with the players coming through, the ability for us to maybe have a shot at 2022 and then 2026, us hosting, that maybe he wasn't ready for the job. And I think he's really proved everybody wrong. But what did you make of the signing at the time, and how did you see him evolve over the course of the time since his appointment?
Well, I think he was perfectly ready for the job. He'd done the job for several years with the women's national team, and he'd achieved somewhat what he could have achieved there. They got on the Olympic podium. They were regularly in the top 5 or top 10 of the world. They hosted a World Cup. They made the World Cup quarterfinal. That's quite successful. And there were potential other offers on the table for Herdman to take, but he wanted another challenge in taking the men's team to new heights. And he took that on, and he certainly has done it. No longer is Canada in the days of, whether that be Benito Floro or any of the other coaches that came through the Canadian national team over the last few years. And once he got onto that men's team, he set out a plan, and he's been able to exceed that plan, even though he'll probably say that making the World Cup in 2022 was all part of the plan all along.
We cannot wait to watch. Can't wait to cheer them on. Also look forward to your coverage. I hope you get over there, Ben. You guys can all find Ben on Twitter at Ben Steiner 00. You can find us on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, of course, across all podcasting networks. Ben, thanks so much for your time. We really appreciate it.
Happy to come on whenever, and thanks for having me. It was a ton of fun.